Dad's voice came through the speakers. My son, who followed in my footsteps, my oldest daughter, who makes me proud, my youngest daughter, here with us tonight. My face burned. I'd stood briefly when he said it, nodded once to the uncertain applause, and sat back down. He'd praised them with accomplishments, pride, specifics. For me, just confirmation. I existed, no name, no detail. Just here with us tonight. The room went still. Heads turned toward the wall-mounted left of the stage. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, because I'd already seen it. I'd stood in front of that wall 20 minutes earlier, reading my full name etched in metal under 3 categories: military service, community endowment, veteran support. The unidentified man behind me stayed standing, letting the truth sit. I wish I could say it began there, but it started weeks earlier. I parked outside the Civic Center on a Tuesday evening and saw the banners first. They stretched across the entrance in bold letters, announcing my father's Lifetime Community Achievement Award, his name, his decades of service, his legacy. The letters were 3 feet tall, visible from the street, impossible to miss. I sat in the car for a moment, engine still running, hands still on the wheel, and told myself I could do this. I could show up, sit quietly, and let him have his night without making it about anything else. I'd done harder things. I'd kept people alive in the back of moving vehicles. I'd made impossible decisions in seconds. I could sit through an awards ceremony without falling apart. The parking lot was already filling up. Cars pulled in one after another, families stepping out in their best clothes, adjusting ties and smoothing dresses. I recognized the rhythm of it, the way people moved when they knew they were about to witness something important, something they'd talk about later. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for another 30 seconds, gathering myself the way I used to before walking into a trauma bay. Inside, the lobby smelled like lemon polish and overbrewed coffee, the kind that's been sitting in a carafe too long and tastes burnt no matter how much cream you add. Round tables filled the banquet hall, each one dressed with white linens, small flags positioned at exact intervals, and tea candles flickering in glass holders that caught the light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the ceiling. The room had the careful, staged quality of an event. Someone had spent weeks planning, every detail considered, every element placed with intention. A volunteer at the registration table handed me a name badge and assumed I was with the family. Her tone was warm, automatic, the kind of warmth that comes from years of welcoming people she doesn't actually know. I didn't correct her. I clipped the badge to my jacket and thanked her quietly. She pointed me toward the main hall and told me to enjoy the evening. I found a seat near the back, close enough to see the stage clearly, far enough not to disrupt the script everyone expected, close enough to matter, far enough to disappear. The balance I'd been walking my entire life. The room filled slowly, in waves. Conversations layered over one another, laughter rising and falling in unpredictable rhythms. I recognized some faces from years ago, people who'd known our family when things looked simpler from the outside, when we fit neatly into the roles assigned to us. A few glanced my way, eyes narrowing slightly as they tried to place me, their expressions shifting through confusion and vague recognition before they turned back to their tables and resumed their conversations. I kept my posture still, my expression neutral, my hands resting lightly on the table in front of me. I wasn't here to be noticed. I was here because he was my father, and this was his night, and I'd made the choice to be present even when presence had never felt like enough. The room had a certain energy to it, the kind that builds before something ceremonial, something people will remember and retell. Waiters moved between tables, pouring water into glasses already beaded with condensation. Someone tested the microphone at the podium, and feedback whined through the speakers before cutting off abruptly. A woman, 2 tables over, adjusted a centerpiece, turning it slightly to the left, then back to the right, then left again, never quite satisfied. I kept my hands still and my voice quiet, choosing restraint on purpose, not because I was weak. There's a difference between silence that protects peace and silence that erases you, and I'd learned to live in that narrow space. Isaiah 43,001 says, God calls us by name, and I held on to that when my own father wouldn't. It wasn't magic, it wasn't a cure. It was just a reminder that someone saw me completely, even when the people at this table never would. My brother arrived first, moving through the room the way Dad had taught him. Firm handshakes delivered with eye contact and slight forward lean, easy jokes that landed with practiced timing, shoulders back and chin level. He worked the crowd like he was running for something, and maybe in his mind he was. He'd followed Dad into the same line of work, learned the same rhythms, carried the same expectations without question or deviation. People lit up when he walked past. They remembered his name. They asked about his projects, his plans, his family. He belonged here in a way I never had, in a way that seemed effortless and inevitable. He made his way toward the front, stopping at nearly every table, leaning down to speak to people I couldn't identify from this distance. He laughed often, big and unguarded, the kind of laugh that filled space and invited others to join in. He was good at this. He'd always been good at this. Where I'd learned to hold still and take up less room, he'd learned to expand, to claim space, to make people glad he'd stopped by their table. My sister came in a few minutes later, composed and polished in a way that looked entirely natural, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor in a rhythm that matched her breathing. She moved with the kind of grace that made you forget she'd practiced it, that made it look like she'd been born knowing exactly how to carry herself in rooms like this. She found Dad near the stage, navigating through clusters of people without ever appearing rushed or impatient. And when she reached him, she kissed his cheek, straightened his tie with the kind of casual intimacy that looked effortless, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He beamed, actually beamed. His whole face changed, softened, opened up in a way I rarely saw anymore. She whispered something close to his ear, something only he could hear, and he laughed. The kind of laugh that only came out when he felt proud, when he felt like the world was confirming everything he'd worked to build. She touched his shoulder lightly before stepping back, and he watched her go with the expression of a man who believed he'd done something right. I watched from my seat and felt the old familiar ache settle in my chest, the one that said I could be competent, disciplined, faithful, steady under pressure, and still not quite right in his eyes. Still not quite what he wanted when he pictured his children. The ache wasn't sharp anymore. It had worn smooth over the years, rounded at the edges, but it was still there, sitting low and constant like a stone I'd learned to carry. The lights dimmed. Conversations dropped to murmurs, then whispers, then silence. The kind of silence that holds anticipation, that makes everyone lean forward slightly in their chairs. The MC stepped to the podium, a man in a pressed suit with silver hair and a voice trained for rooms like this. Warm, authoritative, practiced in the art of making introductions feel both personal and grand. He opened with a joke about traffic that landed well enough to get scattered laughter, then shifted seamlessly into the introduction, his tone dropping into something more serious, more reverent. He listed my father's accomplishments one by one, pausing between each to let them land. Years of service, programs launched that were still running, lives touched in ways that compounded over time, awards earned, boards served, legacies built. After each line, applause rolled through the room like a wave breaking against the shore, building and cresting and falling back only to build again. I clapped politely, measured, my hands meeting just enough to make sound without drawing attention. Just enough to blend in. Dad took the stage with a practiced smile and rigid posture, the kind of stance that said he knew every eye was on him and he'd prepared for exactly this moment. He wore a dark suit, crisp white shirt, tie perfectly knotted. He paused at the podium, gripping its edges lightly with both hands, and let the applause fade naturally, waiting until the room settled into complete silence before he began. He knew how to hold a room. He'd spent decades learning it. He spoke about legacy, about building something that lasts beyond your own lifetime, about the people who shaped him and the people he hoped to shape in return. His voice was steady, confident, the voice of a man who'd spent years learning how to stand in front of crowds and make them believe in the story he was telling. He thanked the community for their support. He thanked the organizers for their work. He made a joke about the coffee that got a good laugh. And then he shifted to what everyone was waiting for, the family. His voice changed slightly, softened at the edges while keeping its core strength. This was the part people wanted, the human element that made the legacy feel real and touchable. "My son," he said, gesturing toward my brother with an open hand, pride radiating from every syllable, followed in my footsteps and became the kind of man I always hoped he'd be. Dedicated. Principled. Someone who understands that real work means showing up every day, even when it's hard. My brother stood, his chair scraping slightly against the floor, and the applause swelled, warm and full and immediate. He smiled, not too wide but genuine, nodded to the room with just the right amount of humility, and sat back down. People at his table reached over to pat his shoulder, and he accepted their congratulations with grace. "My oldest daughter," Dad continued, his voice softening just slightly more, taking on a tender quality that felt both genuine and performative at once, "makes me proud every single day. She's built a life that reflects everything we taught her about service and commitment." My sister rose, graceful and composed, her movements deliberate but not stiff, and the applause came again, just as warm, just as certain. She placed a hand over her heart in quiet acknowledgement, her expression calm and grateful, and returned to her seat with the kind of confidence that said she belonged exactly where she was. Then his gaze swept across the room, scanning the tables, and landed on me. Just for half a second. I saw the calculation happen in real time. I saw him decide. He opened his mouth, paused, recalibrated, and chose his words carefully. "My youngest daughter." He paused again, and the room waited. "Here with us tonight." That was it. No name, no detail, no story. Just the category and a confirmation that I existed somewhere in the room, occupying space, present but undefined. A few people clapped, scattered and uncertain, the sound thin and tentative compared to what had come before. Others scanned the rows, trying to figure out which one I was, their eyes moving across faces until they gave up or got distracted. I stood because staying seated felt worse, because at least standing gave me something to do with my body. I nodded once, a single dip of my chin that acknowledged the room without claiming anything from it, and sat back down. My hands found each other in my lap and held on, fingers interlaced, grounding me in something solid. The applause died awkwardly, trailing off in uneven clusters, and Dad moved on smoothly, his rhythm recovering as he transitioned back to the broader theme of service and sacrifice and the importance of building something that outlasts you. His voice regained its confidence. The room settled back into the story he was telling. I stared at the edge of the stage and focused on my breathing in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The same count I used when a patient's vitals were dropping, and I needed my hands steady enough to start a line, to make the call, to do the next right thing without hesitation. Then the voice came from behind me, calm and deliberate. "Your daughter's name is already on that wall." Chairs scraped, whispers cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the display mounted on the left side of the stage, a large board I'd noticed earlier when I first walked in. I stayed seated, hands still folded because I'd already seen it. I'd stood in front of that wall 20 minutes before the program started, reading the rows of names etched into metal plates, and I'd found mine there among the others. My full name, correct, unabbreviated, listed under 3 categories: military service, community endowment, veteran support. I hadn't put it there. I didn't know who had, but it was there. And now the room knew it too. Dad turned slowly from the podium, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to unease. The applause that had been building toward his closing remarks collapsed into silence. The MC stepped forward slightly, uncertain, and glanced between my father and the wall. Someone in the second row stood to get a better look. Then someone else. The attention in the room pivoted, and for the first time that night, it wasn't pointing toward the stage. The unidentified man behind me stayed standing, hands clasped in front of him, letting the truth sit in the air without adding to it. I grew up as this one. That's how it started, long before the awards or the wall or the night. Everything turned visible. Dad had names for my brother and sister. He used them freely, easily, without hesitation. For me, he had categories. Kids meant my brother and sister. You meant me, delivered with a vague gesture or a glance that never quite landed. He framed it as efficiency, a way to keep things moving without getting bogged down in details. But efficiency has a way of becoming erasure when it's applied to a person long enough. I was the youngest by 8 years. By the time I came along, the family roles already felt assigned, the script already written. My brother was the protege. My sister was the bright, steady one who made everything look easy. I was extra, an afterthought, the one who didn't quite fit the narrative Dad had been building. Mom used my full name deliberately every time, like she was staking a claim. Names are anchors, she'd tell me, when I was young enough to believe her without question. They hold you in place when everything else is shifting. She made sure I heard my name enough at home to remember it belonged to me, even when Dad acted like it didn't. At school events, Dad would introduce my brother and sister with their full names, their grades, their achievements. Then he'd gesture in my direction and say, "And this one," before turning away to talk to someone more important. I learned early that correcting him only made him dig in deeper. If I said, "My name is," he'd cut me off with a look that said I was being difficult, making a scene over nothing. So I went quiet. I learned to stand next to him without expecting to be seen. The first real fracture came when I was 18. I told him I was enlisting, not just enlisting, joining for a medical track. I wanted to be an Army medic, to learn how to save lives under pressure, to do something that mattered in a way I could measure. I'd been thinking about it for months, researching the requirements, talking to recruiters, imagining a version of my life where I had a clear purpose that didn't depend on fitting into someone else's script. He sat behind his desk in the study when I told him, fingers steepled in front of him like he was about to deliver a verdict in a case I hadn't realized I was on trial for. The desk was massive, dark wood polished to a mirror shine, and it had always felt like a barrier between him and whoever sat across from it. I sat in the chair opposite him, the one that was slightly lower than his, and told him my decision. He listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It wasn't our path." He said it slowly, deliberately, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who should have already known better. "Our family built things that lasted," he explained. "We worked in systems, in structures, in legacy. We created institutions and frameworks that outlived us. The military was fine for some people." He acknowledged that with a slight nod. "But it wasn't what we did. It wasn't who we were." He made it sound reasonable, almost compassionate, like he was protecting me from making a mistake I'd regret later. I told him I was choosing something for myself. I said I wanted to do work that had immediate impact, where I could see the difference I was making, where success or failure was abstract. I said I wanted to serve in a way that felt real and urgent and necessary. He framed it as running away. He said I was avoiding the harder work of building something permanent. He said I was choosing the dramatic gesture over the sustained commitment. He said I'd come back eventually, once I realized that adrenaline wasn't the same as purpose. The silence started that night, not the kind of silence that comes from having nothing to say, but the kind that's deployed like a weapon, calculated and deliberate. He spoke to me only when necessary. Logistical questions delivered in a flat tone, yes or no answers that didn't invite conversation, nothing more. He still didn't use my name. If anything, the vagueness got worse, sharper at the edges. "Tell her," became his preferred method when he needed something passed along. He'd say it to my mother, to my sister, and they'd relay the message because it was easier than pushing back, easier than challenging him on something that would only make the atmosphere in the house even more tense. Mom tried to bridge the gap. She'd make dinner and insist we all sit together as if proximity could force connection. She'd ask me about my day and turn to Dad expectantly, waiting for him to do the same. He'd eat in silence, answer only when directly asked a question, and leave the table as soon as he was finished. The space he left felt colder than if he'd never been there at all. The morning I left, he stood in the driveway with his arms crossed over his chest, watching me load my bag into the car. I'd woken up early, hoping to slip out quietly and avoid exactly this moment, but he'd been there waiting. Mom hugged me tight and told me to call whenever I could. My sister squeezed my hand. My brother had already left for work, or at least that's what he'd said. Dad stood apart from all of it, separate, watching. I turned to him before I got in the car, waiting to see if he'd say anything, if he'd step forward, if he'd give me anything I could carry with me into whatever came next. He said, "Be careful." 2 words. That was it. No pride, no fear, no acknowledgement that I was about to step into something bigger than either of us, something that might change me in ways he couldn't predict or control. Just a warning, flat and distant, delivered in the same tone he might use to remind someone to lock the door on their way out, like he was talking to someone he barely knew, someone whose choices didn't really matter to him one way or another. In the Army, names weren't optional. As a medic, I learned fast that someone's name wasn't just identity, it was accountability. It was responsibility made audible. When you called out a name, you were claiming that person, saying, "I see you, I'm tracking you, I'm coming, and help is real and on its way." On a call, if someone went down, you didn't shout, "Hey," or "you," or some vague gesture into the chaos. You shouted their name loud and clear, cutting through whatever noise surrounded you, so they knew help wasn't abstract, wasn't theoretical, wasn't coming eventually. It was there. It was immediate. It was them you were running toward. You charted under their name. Every intervention, every vital sign, every medication administered. You reported under their name in briefings, standing up and saying clearly who you treated, what you'd done, what the outcome had been. You stood in formation and answered when your own name was called, and the answer wasn't casual. It was sharp, immediate, a confirmation that you were present and accounted for and ready. Names meant showing up fast when seconds mattered, meant double-checking wristbands before pushing meds, meant making sure the person in front of you was exactly who you thought they were before you made a decision that could save them or kill them. When my name was called, I answered cleanly and moved, trying to live like my identity was something God saw even when my family wouldn't say it. Proverbs 15,001 reminded me that a gentle answer turns away wrath, and I carried that into every tense moment, every hard conversation, every time I had to stay calm when someone else was falling apart. It helped me answer with clarity instead of defensiveness when a superior questioned my judgment. It helped me de-escalate situations where panic was about to override protocol. It reminded me that how I showed up mattered, that the person I was when pressure mounted revealed more than the person I was when things were easy. The work shaped me in ways I hadn't expected. I learned to function on minimal sleep, to make decisions with incomplete information, to trust my hands even when my mind was screaming with doubt. I learned to read vital signs at a glance, to hear the difference between breathing that would stabilize and breathing that was about to stop. I learned to talk to people who were terrified, to keep my voice steady and my movements deliberate even when my heart was racing, because they needed to believe I knew what I was doing, even when I was figuring it out in real time. I learned names, dozens of them, hundreds of them, people I worked with, people I treated, people whose faces I still see when I close my eyes. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. I carry both groups with me, and I remember their names because someone has to, because names are what keep people from disappearing into statistics. Back home, Dad stayed distant. Contact was rare and logistical forwarded mail that needed my signature, brief calls about paperwork that couldn't be handled remotely, updates about family events delivered through my sister because apparently routing information through a third party was easier than calling me directly. He referred to my work as doing my thing, like it was a hobby I'd picked up and would eventually outgrow, like I was experimenting with the phase instead of building a career. He didn't ask about deployments. He didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd seen. He didn't ask about the people I'd treated, the calls that stayed with me long after they ended, the moments that changed how I understood life and death, and the thin, fragile line between them. He just waited, I think, for me to come back and fit into the script he'd written years before I had any say in it. He waited for me to realize he'd been right all along, that I'd wasted time chasing something temporary when I could have been building something permanent. He waited for me to apologize, maybe, or at least to admit defeat quietly enough that he wouldn't have to acknowledge how wrong he'd been. Mom died while I was overseas. I got the call on a Thursday. It came through at 0300 local time, my sister's voice cracking on a satellite connection that made her sound farther away than she was. She'd been in hospice for 2 weeks. I'd known it was coming, we all had, but knowing doesn't prepare you for the moment it actually happens, for the shift from she's dying to she's gone. I sat on the edge of my bunk in the dark and listened to my sister cry, and I couldn't reach through the phone to hold her, couldn't do anything except say I'd be there as soon as I could. By Saturday, I was back standing in a borrowed dress uniform because mine was still packed somewhere I couldn't access in the chaos of emergency leave. The funeral was in a church I'd attended as a child, back when Mom still had the energy to insist we all go together, back when Dad would sit in the pew next to her and hold her hand during hymns. Now the church felt smaller than I remembered, the ceilings lower, the pews harder. People filled every row. Mom had been loved quietly but widely, the kind of person who showed up for others without making a production of it, who remembered birthdays and brought meals when someone was sick and asked how you were doing in a way that made you believe she actually wanted to know the answer. I stood in the receiving line next to my siblings and shook hands with people who told me stories about her I'd never heard, moments I'd missed while I was gone, pieces of her life that had continued without me. Dad introduced me to people as my daughter, without saying which, no name, no context, no acknowledgement of which daughter I was or why I'd been absent or what I'd been doing while Mom was fading, just the vague recognition that I existed somewhere in the family structure, that I had some claim to grief even if my relationship to it wasn't worth specifying. I didn't correct him. Grief made names feel small that day, made everything feel small except the absence Mom had left behind. We were all just bodies moving through rituals we didn't fully understand, saying the right things in the right order because that's what you did when someone died, because tradition and structure were the only things holding us together when everything else was falling apart. The service was beautiful in the way funerals are when someone's been loved well. People spoke about her kindness, her quiet strength, the way she made everyone feel seen. My brother gave a eulogy that had people crying and laughing in turns. My sister read a poem Mom had loved. Dad sat in the front row with his hands folded, his face composed, and when it was his turn to speak, he talked about their life together in broad, careful strokes, the years, the milestones, the partnership they'd built. He didn't cry, he didn't break. He held himself together the way he always did, with rigid control and careful presentation, and I wondered if he'd let himself fall apart later, in private, or if this was just how he processed loss. By containing it, by refusing to let it spill over into messiness he couldn't manage. I didn't speak. No one asked me to. I sat in the second row behind my siblings and their families, and I held my grief quietly because I'd learned that taking up space in moments like this only made people uncomfortable. I'd learned that my version of loss didn't fit neatly into the narrative Dad wanted to tell about our family, so it was better to keep it contained, to let the day belong to the people who'd been here when it mattered, who'd sat with her in those final weeks when I was halfway around the world treating strangers. Afterward, his pattern continued. Generalities. Distance. No curiosity about my life, my work, the things I carried. If I called, he'd ask surface questions, where I was stationed, when I'd be back stateside, whether I'd gotten the documents he'd mailed about Mom's estate, but he never asked why I stayed or what kept me going. He never asked how I was holding up after losing her, whether I regretted not being there at the end, whether I needed anything from him other than forwarded paperwork and logistical updates. I stopped expecting more. Expecting hurt worse than accepting, so I lowered my expectations until they sat somewhere near the floor, until I could step over them without tripping. The work I did after Mom died wasn't loud. I built a career on steady competence, showing up, staying calm, doing what needed to be done without needing applause for it. In the field, success meant someone walked away who might not have otherwise. It meant clean charts and clear communication and hands that didn't shake when seconds mattered. It didn't mean recognition. It didn't mean awards. It meant the work itself, done right, again and again until competence became reflex. When Mom got sick, I sent money, not a lot at first. I was still junior enlisted, still making barely enough to cover my own expenses, but enough to help with the things insurance wouldn't touch. Co-pays that added up faster than anyone expected, prescriptions that cost more than groceries, transportation to and from appointments when she was too weak to drive herself. I coordinated care resources from halfway across the world, making calls during my off hours to home health agencies and specialist offices and pharmacies, navigating bureaucracies I couldn't see while trying to ensure she had what she needed. Dad never asked how it was funded. He never asked where the money came from or why I was the one handling logistics he should have been managing himself. He just accepted it, the way he accepted everything I did, as if it were happening in a separate world that didn't intersect with his, as if my contributions were invisible because they came from me instead of from one of the children whose work he valued. After she died, I wanted to do something that would last, something permanent that would honor her in a way that felt true to who she'd been. Someone who showed up quietly for people who needed help, who gave without keeping score, who believed that small, sustained acts of care mattered more than grand gestures. I established a small fund in her name. Nothing flashy, no press release, no ceremony. Just a legal structure and a bank account and a mission statement I wrote at my desk in base housing on a Sunday afternoon when I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways she'd been there for other people and how few resources she'd had when she needed help herself. I reached out to a few people I knew, veterans I'd served with who'd gone into civilian sectors with money, people who understood what it meant to commit to something without needing your name on a plaque. I explained what I was trying to build and why it mattered, and they believed me. The fund grew. Not fast, but steady. Small donations that accumulated over time, building into something substantial enough to actually help people instead of just existing as a nice idea that went nowhere. It expanded beyond what I'd originally imagined. Housing support for veterans transitioning out of service who couldn't afford first and last month's rent. Emergency assistance for families hit with unexpected medical costs that threatened to bury them. Counseling resources for people dealing with trauma they couldn't afford to process on their own. I reviewed applications during lunch breaks and late at night after shifts. I signed checks. I followed up with recipients to make sure the money had actually solved the problem it was meant to solve, that we weren't just putting band-aids on wounds that needed surgery. I didn't attach my story to any of it. The fund bore Mom's name, not mine. The website didn't include my biography or my photo or any explanation of why I'd started it beyond a simple statement about honoring someone who believed in helping people. The work didn't need my face or my voice to matter. It just needed to show up, day after day, year after year, making a tangible difference in lives that might otherwise slip through the cracks. People would ask me sometimes why I didn't talk about it more, why I didn't use it to build my own profile or leverage it into something bigger. I'd tell them the work mattered more than the recognition. I'd tell them that visibility wasn't the goal, impact was. Some of them understood. Some of them thought I was wasting an opportunity. I didn't care either way. I'd learned from my father what happened when you built everything around appearances, when legacy meant making sure everyone saw what you'd done instead of just doing it. I wanted something different. I wanted work that would matter even if my name never appeared next to it. Dad believed impact needed a visible narrative. He built his legacy on stages, in speeches, in rooms full of people who could see him doing the work and applaud him for it. He needed witnesses. He needed documentation. He needed proof that could be displayed and pointed to and used to build the story of who he was and what he'd accomplished. I preferred no applause. I preferred the quiet calls from people who'd gotten the help they needed and wanted to say thank you. I preferred the spreadsheets that showed the funds balance growing slowly upward, the applications that kept coming in, the evidence that the work was sustaining itself without requiring constant promotion. The wall took the room. I looked at it now, standing near the back with everyone else, watching heads turn and eyes widen. Rows of names etched in metal. Categories honoring service, contributions, sacrifice. My full name appeared under 3 headings: military service, community endowment, veteran support. Correct. Unabbreviated, permanent. I'd seen it earlier, before the program started, and I'd stood in front of it for a long time, running my fingers over the letters. I hadn't put my name there. I didn't know who had. But someone had decided my work deserved to be visible, even if I'd never asked for it. Dad's face shifted from confusion to unease. He hadn't expected my story to be on display. He'd built his speech around a version of the family that didn't include this, a version where I was present but not centered, acknowledged but not named. The wall didn't care about his version. It just held the truth, cold and factual and impossible to ignore. The unidentified man stayed standing, hands clasped, silent. He didn't need to say anything else. The wall said enough. The MC stepped forward, his voice careful, and gestured toward the display. This wall, he said, honors those who served quietly, people who didn't seek recognition but earned it through years of steady work. He pointed to the section drawing attention, the one with my name. Some of these honorees appear under multiple categories: military service, community endowment, veteran support. It's rare to see someone listed in all 3. Dad raised a hand, his voice altered, smaller than it had been at the podium. I wasn't aware of all of this. The MC nodded. Many of them prefer it that way. The what matters more than the applause. The room eased slightly, the tension loosening just enough to let people breathe again. But the shift had already happened. The script Dad had written no longer held the room. The wall did. I stayed seated, hands still folded, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet, steady knowledge that I'd done the work, and the work had spoken for itself, and no amount of silence could erase that now. Dad stood at the podium, gripping its edges, and I could see him trying to find his footing again. The MC stepped back, giving him space, and the room waited. I didn't know, Dad said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain. I didn't know the extent of it. Someone in the 3rd row said, maybe you should have asked. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it landed, and the room felt it. A few people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Dad's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might deflect, might pivot back to his prepared remarks and pretend the interruption hadn't happened. Instead, he turned slightly and looked toward the back of the room, toward me. I think, he said slowly, we should hear from her. The MC gestured toward me and the room turned. I felt every eye land, felt the weight of expectation settle like a hand on my shoulder. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady, the way I'd learned to move when someone's life was on the line and panic wasn't an option. I stepped onto the stage and stood next to the podium, facing the room. I kept my words simple and controlled, like I was treating the room the way I treated patients, steady hands, no theatrics. I didn't come here to be recognized, I said. I came to honor my father. A few heads tilted, curious. I kept going. The work I've done wasn't for applause. Service shows up day after day, whether anyone's watching or not. That's what I learned in the field, and that's what I carried into everything else. I glanced at Dad, then back at the room. My father taught me to build something that lasts, even when we disagreed on what that looked like. I'm grateful for that. I stepped back. The applause came, steady but not explosive. It felt earned, not given. I returned to my seat, and the program moved forward, but the room had changed. People looked at me differently now. Not with pity, not with confusion, with recognition. Dad stood at the podium again, slower this time, and his voice had lost some of its polish. "My youngest daughter," he said, pausing on each word, "has done more than I knew." He looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. I've spent a lot of years speaking in generalities. I left things out. I made it easier for myself by keeping it simple, and I didn't realize what I was cutting away in the process. The room stayed quiet. I stayed still. Silence can protect the wrong version of truth, I said, standing again. My voice was calm, but it carried. I stayed quiet to avoid embarrassing anyone, but quiet isn't the same as disappearing. My brother stood abruptly, his face tight. I didn't know any of this. I didn't advertise, I said evenly, but you didn't ask. He sat back down. My sister stood next, slower, her hands folded in front of her. I should have asked, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I nodded. She sat. Dad turned to face me fully now, and the distance between us felt both vast and suddenly very small. I thought, he said, his voice rougher now, that I was protecting the family by keeping it simple, by not making things complicated. Simple isn't always honest, I said. He nodded slowly, and for a moment he looked older than I'd ever seen him, smaller, less certain. Say your name, he said. I said it clearly. My full name. The one Mom had used every day, the one etched on the wall behind us. Dad repeated it slowly, carefully, like he was learning it for the first time. I should have been saying it all along. The room stayed quiet. The applause didn't come. This wasn't a moment for applause. It was just the truth, spoken plainly, landing where it needed to land. The award presentation proceeded after that. Photos were taken. Polite applause followed the official speeches. But the room felt different, changed. The version of the story Dad had told wasn't the only version anymore, and everyone knew it. People approached me afterward quietly, near the doors. Veterans shook my hand. Someone told me Mom would be proud. I believed them. Dad watched from a distance, the award tucked under his arm, but he didn't approach. Not yet. I stepped aside to breathe. My brother found me in the lobby, standing near a tall window where headlights from the parking lot cut patterns across the floor. He approached slowly, uncertain. Dad never talked much about your work, he said. I knew you were enlisted, but I didn't know the rest. I nodded. It doesn't make it right, he continued. It just explains it. He paused, then met my eyes. I'm proud of you. I should have said it earlier. Thank you, I said. He stepped back into the crowd, and I was alone again. My sister came next, slower, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She stopped a few feet away and folded her arms, not defensively, just thoughtfully. We all played our parts, she said quietly. Even unintentionally. We did, I agreed. She reached out and squeezed my hand once, then let go. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She left, and the space opened again. I walked out into the parking lot under yellow lights that hummed softly in the night air, casting everything in a sodium glow that made the world look both sharper and less real at the same time. The sound of crickets filled the spaces between cars, a steady rhythm that felt louder than it should have, more insistent. The temperature had dropped while we'd been inside, and I could feel the cool air against my skin, a relief after the warmth of the crowded hall. Dad stood near the curb, slumped slightly in a way I'd never seen him stand before, like someone had removed the invisible rod that usually kept his spine straight, that kept his shoulders back and his chin level. The award was still under his arm, clutched there, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with it anymore, like it had become a burden instead of a prize. He looked up when I approached, and in the yellow light I could see how tired he looked, how the evening had worn him down in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the authority and confidence that usually shaped every word. "A minute," I said. I didn't owe him more than that. I didn't owe him anything, really. But I'd come this far, and it felt wrong to walk away without letting him say whatever he needed to say. He nodded, and we stood there for a moment, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. Cars passed on the street beyond the parking lot, their headlights sweeping across us briefly before moving on. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. The crickets continued their steady chorus. "I built my life on appearances," he said finally, the words coming out slow and deliberate, like he'd been rehearsing them on the walk out here, but they still felt foreign in his mouth. "On a certain story, on a version of things that made sense to me, that fit together neatly. I thought it kept things together. I thought if I could control the narrative, keep it simple and clean and presentable, then everything would stay in place. I thought that was leadership. I thought that was what it meant to be a father, to provide structure, to maintain order, to make sure the family looked like it was supposed to look from the outside. People don't disappear because you won't name them," I said, and I kept my voice level, not angry, but not soft either. "Pretending I wasn't there didn't make me go away. It just made me invisible to you, and maybe that was easier. Maybe it was easier to have a simple story with only 2 children who fit the mold, than to have 3 and have to explain why one of them made different choices." He flinched, just slightly, a small movement that rippled through his shoulders and was gone almost before I registered it. "I was afraid," he admitted, and the word sounded like it cost him something to say out loud. "You went beyond what I understood. You did things I couldn't explain in the way I explained everything else. The military, the medical work, the fund, none of it fit into the framework I'd built for what success looked like, for what our family was supposed to be doing. And I didn't know how to stand next to it without it making me look like I'd failed somehow, like I'd lost control of my own family narrative. I didn't need full understanding," I said. "I didn't need you to be proud of my choices or to think they were the right ones. I just needed acknowledgement. I needed you to say my name when you talked about your family. I needed you to act like I existed as a person, not just as an awkward footnote you had to explain away." He looked down at the award in his hands, turning it slightly so the engraved plate caught the light. "It took a wall of names for me to see what I'd been cutting out," he said quietly. "It took public exposure, public embarrassment, for me to realize that my simple story was just another way of lying. That omission is still dishonesty even when you tell yourself it's just efficiency. I didn't weaponize the moment. I could have. I could have listed every hurt, every dismissal, every time he'd introduced my siblings by name and gestured vaguely in my direction. I could have made him feel small, the way he'd made me feel small for years. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. That wasn't who Mom had raised me to be. Instead, I set a clear boundary. Call things what they are," I said. "Call me by my name, don't repeat the omission. Don't make me disappear again just because it's easier for your story. If we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, it has to be built on truth, not on whatever version is most convenient for you to tell other people." He said, "My name then, carefully, correctly, with the kind of attention you give to something fragile that you're afraid you might break if you handle it wrong." He said it twice, actually, like he was testing it, making sure he had it right. "I promise I won't forget it," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word promise. "I promise I'll do better. I can't take back the years I didn't say it, but I can change what happens from here." I believed him, not because the moment felt miraculous or transformative, or like something out of a movie where everything gets fixed with one conversation. I believed him because it was the first time he'd ever had to look directly at what his silence had done, at the real cost of his careful omissions, and I could see in his face that he'd finally understood it. Understanding didn't erase the hurt, didn't make up for lost time, didn't fix everything that was broken, but it was a start. I drove home with the radio off, watching the town shrink in the rearview mirror. The streets looked smaller in the dark, less significant. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection, tired but steadier. The face looking back at me knew its own name, and that was enough. At home, my phone buzzed with messages. Proud of you. About time. Your mom would have loved this. I read them all and set the phone down. I didn't label it a miracle, just a small act of truth. I prayed for the strength to keep my boundaries without turning bitter, to let the correction stand without needing to defend it over and over. Days later, Dad called. He used my name. It sounded strange in his voice at first, unfamiliar, like he was testing the shape of it. But it was there. He'd said it. The following weekend, I visited Mom's grave. I told her the correction had been made. I told her names mattered, just like she said. I stayed for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees, and then I left. The work continues. The fund still operates. The wall still holds my name. I still answer when I'm called, steady and clear, because that's what I learned to do when someone's life was on the line. If you've ever done work that no one saw, or carried a name that someone refused to say, I hope you know it still counts. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when it takes years, even when it takes a wall.